Jason Riley of the Wall Street Journal has, I think, the best piece on Martin Luther King's legacy and where we stand today. The left has tried to see MLK's legacy and say that he was actually a failure because America failed him. In reality, America did not fail Dr. Martin Luther King. America has done its best to live up to his legacy. Okay, so here, that doesn't mean that there's no racism in the United States. It does mean that to pretend that there has not been unbelievable progress and that racism is a fringe element in the United States right now is to ignore reality. So Jason Riley says, racial gaps that were steadily narrowing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s would expand in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, which suggests that the disparities that continue today aren't being driven by racism, notwithstanding claims to the contrary from liberals and their allies in the media. It also suggests that attitudes toward marriage, education, work, and the rule of law play a much larger role than the left wants to acknowledge. More marches won't address out-of-wedlock childbearing. More sit-ins won't lower black crime rates or narrow the school achievement gap. Even electing and appointing more black officials, which has been a major priority for civil rights leaders over the past half-century, can't compensate for these cultural deficiencies. Black mayors, police chiefs, and school superintendents have been commonplace since the 1970s, including in major cities with large black populations. Racially gerrymandered voting districts have ensured the election of blacks to Congress. Even the election of a black president twice failed to close the divide in many key measures. Black-white differences in poverty, home ownership, and incomes all grew wider under President Obama. Discussion of antisocial behavior in poor black communities, let alone the possibility that it plays a significant role in racial inequality, has become another casualty of the post-60s era, writes Jason Riley, the black columnist over at the Wall Street Journal. King and other black leaders at the time spoke openly about the need for more responsible behavior in poor black communities. After remarking on a disproportionately high inner-city crime rate, King told a black congregation in St. Louis, quote, "We've got to do something about our moral standards." He added, quote, "We know there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves." King's successors mostly ignored this advice, preferring instead to keep the onus on whites. Where King tried to instill in young people the importance of personal responsibility and self-determination, notwithstanding racial barriers, his counterparts today spend more time making excuses for counterproductive behavior and dismissing criticism of it as racist. Activists who long ago abandoned King's colorblind standard, which was the basis for the landmark civil rights laws enacted in the 1960s, tell black youths today that they are victims first and foremost. A generation of blacks who have more opportunity than any previous generation are being taught that America offers them little more than trigger-happy cops, bigoted teachers, and biased employers. It's not only incorrect, but as King and a previous generation of black leaders understood, it's also unhelpful. The reason that I read all of this from Jason Riley is because this is the important part of Dr. King's legacy. The important part is the part that we know. It is the part that we know. It doesn't mean we shouldn't study the rest of Dr. King's life and analyze how he brilliantly used the power of media and brilliantly used the power of social demonstration in order to push his agenda. We should do all of these things. I'm all for a more well-rounded, nuanced picture of history. But if we're going to say, what do we celebrate about Dr. Martin Luther King, it is a colorblind standard that the left today is in the midst of rejecting wholesale. The intersectional ideology of the left fully rejects all of this. The intersectional ideology of the left fully suggests that you cannot have a colorblind society, that Dr. Martin Luther King was in fact wrong, that Dr. Martin Luther King was incorrect in his assessment of his dream. His dream itself was a problem. And I present as evidence to you an article by a professor named Kimberly Crenshaw. She's executive director of the African American Policy Forum and a professor of law at Columbia University. She is also the inventor of the concept of intersectionality. And in the column that she wrote for the Washington Post, I think it was a couple of years ago, she explained that intersectionality isn't only supposed to be a way of describing different experiences based on group identity. It's not just supposed to be that Democrats are saying, yeah, black people have one kind of experience and white people have another kind of experience. Instead, intersectionality, which is what the Democratic Party pushes, is supposed to be a way of promoting a leftist political agenda. She writes in the Washington Post, quote, "Intersectionality was my attempt to make feminism, anti-racist activism, and anti-discrimination law do what I thought they should, highlight the multiple avenues through which racial and gender oppression were experienced so that the problems would be easier to discuss and understand." So what does she mean by this? She means that the legacy of America is racist and that there is no way to overcome that. White privilege means we can never overcome this. Even if every white person in America were to acknowledge quote-unquote white privilege and suggest that the system is built for them, they would still not have anything to say. Because even then, there are certain racist bones in the white body that cannot be overcome. There are literally colleges that are teaching kids that if they say, I am colorblind, this is an element of racism. If you say, I don't judge people based on color, this is a microaggression. I am not kidding. This is something that is said at universities across the land. That is a direct rejection of Dr. King's dream. So what is the left doing? They're saying, well, really, Dr. King's dream wasn't the colorblind society. That was just a bunch of sloganeering for the cameras. What his dream really was racial separatism and competing interest groups. His real dream was the Bernie Sanders socialist agenda that would overcome race with redistributionism. He was really a class warrior rather than a warrior in favor of racial integration. This is not why America celebrates Dr. Martin Luther King. And to pretend otherwise is, I think, a bit of nasty revisionist history that has some pretty serious consequences for the future of the country. Okay, well, meanwhile, speaking of political polarization pushed by the left, you can see that the left is not interested in the sort of integration, in the sort of peaceful talking that Martin Luther King was attempting to push. One of the people who is supposedly a successor to Reverend King, Reverend Dr. King, is Al Sharpton. It just demonstrates the fall off in the level of political discourse and the level of racial leadership that Al Sharpton is considered anywhere akin to Martin Luther King. It's just insane. Al Sharpton is a race hustler. Al Sharpton has made himself a fortune by blackmailing companies, by calling them racist. Al Sharpton is a guy who has twice helped initiate violence against Jews. Al Sharpton is just the scum of the earth. He's the scum of the earth, Al Sharpton. And yet here he is talking about Martin Luther King and talking about how Donald Trump has made racial intolerance vogue again, despite the fact that Al Sharpton legitimately called called Jews white interlopers in Harlem and suggested that diamond merchants in New York were responsible for killing black children. Okay, Al Sharpton is the worst of the worst. And here he is talking about how Trump has made racial intolerance in vogue again.
I think what people really don't understand, for those of us that grew up in the King movement and the generation after King, is that we mark the 50th anniversary with the challenges that we have a president that has made this kind of racial divide and intolerance become vogue again. Because when you look at what Donald Trump is doing around pet questions of people of color, Mexicans, blacks, Muslims, he has reintroduced what Dr. King's life was against.
It's taken us back.
Taken us really back. Years.
Okay, so again, here's the problem. I'm not fond of a lot of Trump's rhetoric. I was very critical of President Trump's response to Charlottesville, which I thought was egregious. During the election cycle, I thought that his response to questions about the KKK was just awful. I think President Trump has a nasty habit of saying things that are really inflammatory about race, and that is not a good thing. But to suggest that Trump is the one who's responsible for the racial uptick, the uptick in racial animosity in the country, is not supported by data. It's just not. Okay, if you look at moods about race in the United States, they were at an all-time high by the time George W. Bush left office. And then if you look at mood about race with regard to divides between the races, it jumped as soon as Obama took office, and it continued to grow while the president was in office, right? And now Trump has taken office, and it hasn't narrowed. And that's not a shock because, again, when one side embraces the idea that the colorblind dream is no longer a dream but a nightmare, then you end up with a racially polarized society.